This conference will now be recorded.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and call the regular meeting of the Airport Advisory Board for October 19th, 2023 to order. Would you like to call the roll real quick, please?
Jay,
Present.
Bart. Did you talk to him about it? Jeff,
Present.
Scott,
Oh, we can't hear.
Oh, he can't. Oh, I'll say what Robin's saying for her. Jason is here.
Bill,
Here.
Bill's here.
And Rocco.
Here.
All right. Well, we have a quorum. Would you like to lead us in a Pledge of Allegiance?
Certainly.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Is there our minutes that we have for last January? We haven't had a meeting in a while. Has everybody had a chance to review the minutes? Are there any changes, additions, or corrections?
Changes, I sent them to you today.
I may not have seen them.
It said second FBO. The city is interested in a second FBO that doesn't sell jet fuel, is what
Instead of
it
just
said.
fuel.
Instead of just fuel.
It was on number 95.
And it was a limited use FBO instead of a full use FBO.
Okay. Is there a motion to accept the minutes?
I can make a motion to accept the minutes as written.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I don't get to vote. All right. Any opposed? All right. The minutes are approved. The next item on our agenda is public comments. If there is any member of the public that would like to comment on an item that's not otherwise on the agenda, please step forward, state your name, your residence, and please make your comments. Please limit those to 3 minutes or less. The timer will run. Is there anybody that would like to make a comment in the chambers? Is there anybody online that would like to make a comment? Okay, hearing none, we'll close the public comment section of the meeting and move to item 5, which is the airport manager report.
Thank you, Jason.
Mr. Biggs?
Let's see. Yeah, can you share that screen? Oh, sorry, you do that first. And then go to the PowerPoint if you can. So I had Adam, one of the assistants at the airport, Adam, just put on a bunch of pictures of what's he's seen happen at the airport since you guys met here last. So you guys all see that? Can you guys online see that? Anyway, so
Yes, we.
just had some, oh, thanks, Scott. So anyway, since January, we had a huge snow season last year, so we did a lot of snow removal. We've had a lot of fun balloon activities. We had some unique balloons this year. The snow and ice caused a lot of problems with the antennas and the cables for the AWAS. And we're going to be talking about the AWAS later today too. But the snow and ice just grabbed onto those cables. It pulled them over, tweaked them. We had to get up there and do a bunch of stuff. So it was frustrating. We had the flooding, so we went out and filled a bunch of sandbags and did a bunch of fun things. We had a Taste of Heber event in June. It was very well attended. I think about 1,000 people showed up. We just got a bunch of local restaurants and stuff, set up a bunch of tents out by the museum. So we just had local restaurants, local bands, just focused on local things. The community seemed to like it a lot, so we'll probably do that again next year. This was UAOA, that's all of the airport managers in Utah. We get together twice a year. I'm serving as the president right now, so I had to put it on. So we did it here in Heber. Ryan, that's here, was gracious enough to sponsor it for us. So we were at the UVU Wasatch campus here in town. Had a lot of good speakers. We had Steve Ossett's office came and gave a presentation. We had some, another guy gave a presentation on gliders at airports. Another guy gave a presentation on bush pilots or backcountry pilots of Utah. We had Katie that did our, helped us through the public outreach for the master plan. She did a presentation. So, and then the FAA did some training and they did a presentation. UDOT Aeronautics gave one. So we get together every 6 months. Every March we do it down in St. George. And then in the fall we rotate to different locations. So we've been to Vernal, Salt Lake, all over the place. So we just pick one every year. So that went really well. The EAA chapter at our airport's been very active this year. They've been doing really good. Bob Baird kind of spearheads that. And they just have guest speakers and we're getting more people from the community that are coming to those, more pilots. It seems to be growing and doing well. As always, we have this is a bunch of college kids, I think from BYU came and toured the museum and had some activities out here, lots of little Boy Scouts and church groups and all that stuff. Dance that the museum puts on. We had a couple of flyovers. This was I guess it was the 100-year anniversary of the aircraft that fuels aircraft in the air. So they flew over. I guess the first pilot in that, I believe, was a Utah resident. So anyway, that was kind of fun. And then we had, I don't remember what the other flyover was. We had another one. Not too many accidents or incidents. This guy had a brake failure. She was just taxiing down to 4, so we didn't have to shut down the airport or anything. That was nice, but that was one of the exciting things. We had a pipe break out by the balloon field out there that was gushing out, so that was fun. I don't have more pictures of this. This was cool. So we're working on the phase 2 of the environmental study down at the landfill out past the museum. So we went out and we laid this cable. There's only one company I think that does this, but we made a grid every 1,000 feet or so in one direction and then in the opposite direction. We did the phase 1 environmental in 2019. I went out with an environmentalist guy and basically we had an excavator and I just dug as deep as I could dig. And if we found garbage, then we'd move out a little ways and we'd dig down until we didn't find any. Made sure there wasn't any major tanks or oil or anything like that. So we knew generally where the outline was, but we had no idea how deep it was. And instead of drilling holes all over the place trying to figure that out, we had this company come out. There's that red cable you can see in that background, and it's I don't know 1,500 feet long or 2,000 feet long. So every 12 feet there's a break in the covering, so it's exposed metal, and so then we went through the weeds and just bushwhacked for I don't know 1,500 feet, and then every 12 feet we pounded these kind of T-stake looking things, and so we drill a hole, spray it with salt water, and then pound the stake in there, and then you hook an alligator clip up to that stake and then to the cable, and then they have a generator and they push all this power through the generator, and it reads that screen right there. That's showing you how deep it is, what kind of materials are similar, and that kind of thing. And so you get multiple of these slides basically, and you put them together, and then they form this 3D model, and it shows you basically how deep it is and where it is, and it goes all the way to the edge of the runway and out past the AWAS, almost to the fence out there, and it's like 80 feet deep in some parts. So 80. So it used to be from what I understand, it used to be a borrow pit. So they dug this big hole and they were selling rock and gravel and dirt and stuff. And then the locals just started throwing the trash into this hole and burning it and filling it up and burning it. So they're investigating all this. This is part of our phase 2 environmental study that we're doing. I've talked to a lot of locals that used to go with their dads and stuff, usually older guys, but I don't know. I don't know what year that was. I'm sure they'll have it in the report, but it started way long ago because the county sold it to the airport or to the city for airport land use. I want to say I think it was before the 40s. It was the 40s or before the 40s. This is old, and it was unpermitted. So the state didn't recognize it as a landfill. So we're having to send a letter to the state saying, hey, we have this thing that used to be a landfill. Here's all the things that we've done. Here's what we're doing. We're going to monitor these wells. We're going to see if there's any seepage getting into the water, and then see if that's sufficient for them so that we can then we can do like soil compaction studies to find out like, can you build on this? Can you not? Can we just cap it off? Like if it's not leaching already into the water system, then can we just cover it with pavement and make it our new apron? Is that sufficient? So we just have to find out what the state says. So that was a very interesting project, and there was a bunch of us out there doing that for a couple of days. We were able to do it without shutting down the taxiway or anything, so it's nice. Typical stuff. The mower broke, and AWAS. This little box right here, this is a junction box. So this right here spins and tells you your wind speed, and this one over here is a little flap, and that shows you your wind direction. That's how our AWAS gets its information for the wind. So the winds were just showing up weird on the AWAS. So we kept trying different things. Our technician kept coming out and trying to figure it out. And eventually he figured it was something in this box right here where the wires go out to the wind readers, or this cable that goes down to the first kind of computer. So we replaced that cable, replaced that junction box, and it's working again. So the cloud visits, so we got normally the only people that issue NOTAMs at our airport is me or sometimes the FBO, and it's usually runway conditions or if the AWAS is getting worked on or something like that. I didn't even hear that we had this. Nadim had sent an email saying that that there was this NOTAM out saying that our clouds were incorrect. So the FAA said that the AWAS was saying that it was partly cloudy, even though the pilots were reporting clear skies, and it was because there was a wasp nest that was growing over the lens that shoots up into the sky. So I knocked the wasp nest out and called them back, and they canceled the NOTAM.
Was it actually, I noticed it wasn't reporting accurate cloud conditions.
Yeah, so that was from that wasp nest. So it should be back. Yeah.
Please just make sure microphones. We can't hear you guys.
Sorry. We're talking about the wasp nest.
Yeah, so I cleared out a wasp nest out of the oscillometer so that the clouds are accurate again. And we're working to get a new AWAS as soon as we can. It looks like it'll be in March-ish, give or take a month. And I'll go over that in a second too. We were also going over the flight path timeline and the master plan, all that. That has been finished. I've sent that to Jason, so we got the ALP approved without the FAA doesn't have any concerns about it. So the city signed it. FAA sent us our letter that said you're approved, with the caveat of if we have any issues with our environmental assessment, then obviously it wouldn't work. But as long as our environmental assessment that we'll be doing for it's going to take a year to a year and a half. As long as that's good, then the overall master plan is approved. And then as you do individual projects, then you do like very specific, more in-depth environmental studies for those.
Congratulations.
Oh yeah, you guys too. Congratulations. So it's a good plan, I think. Like I said, we had a huge winter this year, as you guys know. We were just plowing and blowing snow and all that. We had the snow festival during Sundance. That was a huge hit. So we had a bunch of people come to that as well. We had a couple art projects done, some more murals on the back. We did one for the balloons. This is a local high school girl that wanted to do some art about women in aviation. Beth Ann Schneider is one of the only women on the airfield that has a hangar that has a paintable back on it. Jay's wife is also one of our female pilots. So she didn't want anything with Amelia because Amelia gets way too much attention. So it was 3 other ones, the first woman to get a commercial license and stuff like that. And then Beth Ann took her up. Her name is Scout. So she took Scout up. So if you go along Hangar Row, there's like some quotes from some of these women in aviation. We didn't have a lot of fire operations this year because it's been raining. So that's been nice. So that's basically some of the fun things that have been going on. Obviously, we also had lots and lots of meetings with the FAA and UDOT Aeronautics and airport engineers and the consultants and the attorneys and all that. So that's some of the stuff that I've been doing this year. I think Jeremy Cook was going to come for your next item. I guess you can announce the next item, but Jeremy Cook's not coming, but I'll talk about that in a
Okay.
second.
Is that the end of your report?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any questions for Travis?
Thanks for all you're doing out there. You do an amazing job.
I got a note from Bill. His internet dropped. He said he was going to try to call back in. Rocco or Scott, do you have anything to ask of Travis?
No, I don't. And it was, again, great job, Travis. You keep that place operating.
My only thing, Travis, is when are we going to redo the logo on the hangar to match the new city logo?
Well, we don't have an airport logo yet, so I'm leaving it for a while.
All right, let's move on to the general business side. The next item was the updates and changes to the Airport Advisory Board bylaws.
So basically, I think the main thing was that we provided a seat for OK3 to be here. So Nadim or his representative will be on the Airport Advisory Board, so that we can get OK3's perspective on all of the topics that we discuss.
So I think we actually do need to have a person named, though. It's not just like
Yeah,
an
no,
open seat.
I
So-
believe Nadim is the named representative at this time.
But if Nadim can't attend, a designee wouldn't be able to just sit on the board in his place, right? It'd have to be like, they have to actually be named to the board. I think that's
I don't know.
the way it is.
Yeah, well, we can ask Jeremy or Steve that question.
Okay. All right, well,
And Mike Duggan resigned.
okay.
I learned that through the newspaper is where I learned that, but he resigned. He sent from the newspaper article, it said that he sent a letter in to the mayor, and
Okay.
so.
Okay.
Will Nadim fill?
For now, yes. I think it still has a position open for a representative from Daniel if they have one and want one. I told the mayor if they have any, if our mayor and the mayor of Daniel have someone that they want to assign, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Okay, outstanding. That's their prerogative. Next item on the, and I should say, it'll be nice to have Nadim or a representative from OK3 here. I think we all recognize that they're an important contributor to the airport, not only for people that are coming in to use the airport, but also, ensuring that we have, viability of landing fees and selling fuel and providing services to, those of us that are on the airport as well. So it'll be nice to be able to have them here, to be able to engage in conversation and hear different perspectives on different topics. So some of us have a pilot perspective, some of us have a commercial perspective, and hopefully some of us will share both. So I look forward to that. Next item on the agenda, Ryan, you're going to talk to us about comparable airports and a rate fee study. And I should say that this is distinct from the kind of draft feasibility study that was presented with the master plan. Okay.
Oh, Ryan, you probably need a microphone. You'll come over there. Do you want this mouse over there? You're good? Of course you did.
I'd like you to use your professor voice too, please. Oh, okay.
Can you guys hear me online?
We can't see them, but we're going to assume that they
Okay.
can hear you.
Perfect. Well, yes, Kurt asked me to come and just talk about the rates and fees study that we're getting prepared to start for the airport. Jason, you kind of alluded to the feasibility analysis that we did previously. So this is actually the third study that we're doing for the airport now. The first one started in 2002. I think we finished it in November. It was accepted in December. And that was first to look at what would be the cost to the airport if we didn't take FAA funds and stayed as a B2 category airport, right? And so the results of that, if you don't accept federal funds, it would cost the city as much as $87.5 million to continue running the airport for the next 20 years. So obviously that was a no-go. Then we went back and did an ARC C2 upgrades financial analysis. We did this earlier in 2023, and this was the feasibility study where we said, can the airport become self-sufficient and still find a way to pay for the ARC upgrades or the C2 upgrades that are required under the ALP? Now, that study found that under the current rates and fees, you'd have a deficit of approximately $9 million over the 20-year period, or about $500,000 a year, if you don't increase airport fees. Now, a caveat with that is that assumes that all ALP projects are completed, and we're basically using estimates for projects that we don't know when they're going to be done and how much they're going to cost.
And the other caveat, I guess I'm just going to ask you is that assumes a steady state of commercial activity at the airport, right? So you don't necessarily need to increase fees, but what you're saying here is that you're going to have a deficit of $451,000 of revenue.
That's right. We did assume a 3% annual increase in activity. So there was like an adjustment for activity on the airport, assuming the rates were the same. But that's not how rates and fees are really set. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Is
okay.
This was really more of what I'd call a survey of. We did look at comparable airports and what the rates and fees are there. I'm going to get into that in a minute. But we were really just trying to see feasibly, is it possible for the airport to be able to pay for the required upgrades to go to a C2 and complete the ALP. And
that was required under the master plan too, correct? Okay.
I apologize for the small text here. So Kurt was giving me a hard time about the title of the slide, Goldilocks grant assurances, right? When we talk about grant assurances, these are what I call the strings that are attached to the money that you get from the FAA. They give you quite a bit of money, usually about 90% for a smaller airport out of AIP funds to be able to match for capital projects. There's no such thing as free money though. There's always strings attached. And there's really 4 main grant assurances that relate to rates and fees at least that are relevant for doing this study. The first one is that the FAA expects the airport to have a goal of self-sufficiency. Doesn't mean that you actually have to be self-sufficient, but that you're making decisions in the best interest of the airport to try and get to that self-sufficiency. And you can see here, I underlined and highlighted recovering its costs. That's really the goal when you're setting rates and charges, is to be able to recover the costs of the airport. And the next 2 points kind of hit on that as well. There is no profit motive for an airport. So when you're setting rates and charges, the idea is to recover the cost of the airport. You can have a surplus, you can have a contingency fund, but you're not setting, when we talk about market-based pricing, it's not like a house where the prices just go up and you're setting whatever anybody's willing to pay. There's a cap on what you can really charge, because the more surplus you generate, there has to be a use for that surplus. You don't want to build up a huge contingency fund, because if there's no use of that money, it's just going to sit there. And that would be detrimental to the users of the airport. And also, it's really tempting for the city to see a pot of money and want to kind of stick their hand in that and use it for other things. And that's the main grant assurance that gets people in really big trouble. That's where you start getting into Part 13 and Part 16 complaints, is what we call revenue diversion. So any revenue that's generated at the airport has to stay in a closed financial system, meaning that has to as that money is spent, it has to benefit the airport. It can still be spent outside of the airport. For instance, as you have ARF services that are provided by the city, or if there's some direct economic benefit to the airport that's being done with a city project, there are cases where you can do transfer out of the enterprise fund, but you have to be very, very careful anytime the city is trying to use revenue that's generated from the airport for other projects, particularly that are aeronautical use cases. So there's the kind of sweet spot that you need to get into of charging enough to recover the cost, but also not generating so much that you have an excessive surplus, or moving that money outside of the airport back to the city. And the last one that is usually tied into rates and fees is this concept of economic non-discrimination. The idea that comparable operators at the airport need to be treated the same. And so this language is not mine. I took all of this stuff off of FAA documents. So I know it's wording that's not great, but just the way the grant assurance reads itself, it says airports shall be subject to such non-discriminatory and substantial comparable rules and regulations, right? And that's one of those documents that we work on. Conditions, which I kind of equate to minimum standards, and then rates, fees, rentals, and other charges, or we're lumping that together as rates and fees. So that really kind of creates an ecosystem of documents that go and help to not only identify rates and fees and how they're determined, um, but how everybody's going to be treated at the airport to make sure there's no discrimination across individual users within a category of users. So again, here's some language out of the airport compliance manual. This is the kind of what they call the Bible for airport managers. It gives a lot of guidance. It's non-regulatory, but it's all guidance for airport managers to effectively comply with those grant assurances, and it covers a lot of different topics. What it says here is that you want to, in establishing uniform rates and charges, the sponsor should also establish minimum standards. The reason for that is, again, you want to make sure that everybody's treated the same, and you're not having somebody that is either paying a higher price for the same services or are treated under different conditions. So I talk about rules and regulations. Those are that's the document that kind of guides safe operation at an airport for all users. Then you go into minimum standards. That applies specifically to commercial aeronautical operators. So what are the requirements to be able to apply for a permit to operate on the business? Usually minimum insurance requirements and also minimum services that are offered. The intent with the minimum standards is to make sure that the airport users are having the services that they require being provided at the airport. And then there's the rates and fees. And that's what we're looking at in this study. And a lot of people think of rates and fees particularly as just what are the price that we're going to set, what are the fees that we're going to set. Doing that, you also need to identify the allowable costs and what's called the airport rate base. So the rate base is essentially the cost of running the airfield itself. And that's important because the FAA defines in their policy and rates and charges what an allowable cost is. And you're using that rate base essentially to calculate what those fees need to be to recover your cost. So when we talk about cost recovery, it's really how do we cover that rate base? And then the FAA prefers that the rates be kept as low as practical because that helps promote aeronautical activity. That's the whole idea of having an airport, is having more aeronautical activity. And also that the rates be established in consultation with local users. There's 3,300 airports in the NIPIAS, the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems. Those are the ones that are federally funded. The FAA doesn't want to get involved in local issues, particularly setting rates and fees. And so they trust the airport to do that in consultation with the users and kind of work it out themselves. There's really two ways to increase revenue at an airport. Obviously increasing rates and fees, which we're talking about, as well as increasing the operations that those rates and fees are based on. Now, in having been at a couple of these meetings and attended public meetings, increasing aeronautical activity at the airport's not something that the community really wants to see. So you're almost kind of stuck. There's really two levers that you can do to drive airport revenue, but one of them is the FAA would like to see increased aeronautical activity. They want to see lower rates that promote that, but the community doesn't like seeing that as well. And so it's kind of a difficult spot that you're stuck in, where obviously there's going to be natural growth, and you want to promote aeronautical activity at the airport, but there's a fine balance of setting rates and fees that encourage more growth than what I think the community really would desire to see.
Can I ask you a couple questions?
Please, absolutely. Yep.
So my first question is the definition of minimum standards. So that is the definition of minimum standards. It's actually taken from regulatory language and then put in an advisory manual here, right? But it only deals with commercial aeronautical activity.
Minimum standards are only for commercial aeronautical service providers.
So today, Heber City Airport has minimum standards that deal with non-commercial aeronautical activity.
Yeah.
So are those enforceable or permissible?
Good question. I don't know. That would be a good question for the attorneys. When we do minimum standards, that's one of those things where you can put them into the minimum standards, but whether it's enforceable or not is a different question. So we've seen
But it's in direct violation of, or in contrast, I won't use the term violation, to what the FAA defines as a minimum standard.
Yeah, so the language I've got up there is just how I differentiate between the different documents, right?
I mean, but that's a quote, right?
Yes, the quote there is out of the airport compliance manual.
Okay.
Yeah.
which is for conduct of commercial.
Yeah, the intent is really to create a level playing field for the businesses that are operating on the airport. That's why you have minimum standards. So they shouldn't really be applied to somebody that's not providing a service on the airfield.
Second item that I would say, and you had touched on this, is, I sell burgers and tacos, right? And so, we've had inflation, right? So you raise your prices and, at some point you raise your prices and the volume drops off, right? So just raising prices doesn't always generate more revenue because you hit this kind of price elasticity argument,
yep.
right? Which is an important thing. And then the last statement that I would say is that, I sat through all those public meetings as well, which was really great to hear from the public. And I think, by and large, what I heard was that the public wasn't opposed to increased aeronautical activity. They were opposed to certain types of increased aeronautical activity, and they enjoyed the airport as long as it wasn't going to, result in, large amounts of increased jet traffic, larger jet traffic that was coming in. But that's only a small part of aeronautical activity.
And that's a good clarification too. Yeah, and it's not really consideration as we set rates and charges as what the public wants from the airport, but it's a consideration that obviously has impacts here in Heber. So
because there's different aeronautical activities. Sometimes it's not just flying an aircraft, right? There's all sorts of other aeronautical activity that relate to an airport.
Yeah, and I'm using that term pretty broadly. When we talk about fuel flowage fees, obviously that's gallons of fuel pumped. I include that in aeronautical activity, even though it's not an operation. Yeah.
Sorry, I just
No,
think
that's
it's
great.
important when somebody listens to this meeting to understand that it's not all one and the same.
Yeah, and if you guys do have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I wanted to have this more of a conversation.
Like a lecture.
Absolutely. So the last point here, the FAA has a lot of rules on what not to do in setting rates and charges, but they don't have a prescriptive way of doing it. They say that any methodology that you want to, any approach to setting rates and charges is acceptable as long as it's applied consistently to similarly situated commercial aeronautical users and it conforms to these rates and charges policy that they have, which is quite outdated. You see the data on there is 1996. They've tried to update this. There's been a lot of industry feedback. They've gone through rulemaking committees on it, gotten feedback on those rulemaking committees, but that's still the official document that's up there. A lot of that policy really relates to what's considered allowable costs, and it's when you read through it, it's more intended for air carrier airports, Part 139 airports. It's still the policy that applies to everybody, but a lot of the stuff in that document is focused on air carrier airports and making sure you're not discriminating against individual air carriers at the airport.
Ryan, the other thing is when you talk about in consultation with local users, right? I think it's important to understand that that's why there's airport advisory boards at a lot of airports, because we're providing that consultative input. And, that's one of the reasons it'll be great to have, Nadeem or somebody from OK3 on here as we get a different perspective to give to our experts, right? I mean, that's part of the reason that we're here.
Yeah, exactly. And because there's no single way of doing this for setting the rates and fees, the impact could be disproportionately shared across the different types of users at the airport. And that's why you really want to get input from all the different users to make sure that it's not disproportionately affecting one category of user or individual users within a category. So airport revenues, I mentioned that all airport revenues have to stay within the closed financial system. When you look at the revenues at Heber, it's pretty unique actually. The chart on the right-hand side is the breakdown of forecasted revenues for 2023. This is where we started that last financial analysis off to look at what the revenues have been for the last few years and forecast these revenues out for the next 20 years. I added a column in here of percentage breakdown because it's really interesting to see that fuel flowage fees is only 12% of the total revenue. In fact, when you look at fuel flowage fees, ground lease fees, and landing fees, that accounts for 90% of the revenue at the airport. The fuel flowage fees are typically the largest source of revenue for a general aviation airport, but it's very unusual for a GA airport to have landing fees. And so really what you're seeing is, I think landing fees kind of subsidizing the fuel flowage fees that you typically see at an airport this size. So when we do this rates and fees study, that's one of those things to take in consideration, right? I'll get into the different methods, about cost recovery versus market-based. But as we look at market-based cost, keep in mind that every airport's different because you're recovering your costs. So what you set the rates at are really intended for your specific airport. And we can look at other rates around at comparable airports, but not all those comparable airports are going to have as much revenue coming from landing fees either.
What is our flowage fee right now? Do you know?
It's 5 cents.
Okay.
And I'll skip ahead here a little bit. You can see on the chart here, the Jet A fuel flowage fees, the average of the airports that we looked at was 15 cents. Heber was by far the lowest priced in the survey that we did. So let me jump back here. There's additional sources of GA revenue that you can look at, but most of these don't add up to a lot. I don't think you're going to see a big shift in that 90% of revenue coming from those top three, right? I think when you add those up, it's probably what 94% of revenue comes from those three sources. We can talk about transient parking fees, aircraft parking, rental car and TNC fees. All of these things will add revenue into that pot of money that's going to help offset the costs, but it's not going to make a huge shift in what you're seeing from those three main sources of revenue.
But the transient parking fees today, the FBO leases the land,
Yep.
and they should be the ones that are charged. I mean, are you saying that there would be an additional fee?
No, some airports have their own ramp. So if the airport's paying for the ramp, then you can charge transient parking fees that are collected by the FBO, and those come back through to the airport, usually with an administrative fee for the FBO to keep. So I didn't say these are all applicable to Heber. These are just some common type of other fees.
We do have a fee right now for commercial aeronautical permits.
Yep.
So, I mean, that one's on there, but we do collect that today.
Yeah, good point. I don't know if we had, so you see the licenses category is blank. So I don't know if it's necessarily considered in the analysis that we did.
I think it's up on the airport business FBO SASO fees.
That could be, yeah.
Are there any transient parking fees right now that are not collected by the FBO?
At Heber?
Yeah.
I don't think so. Travis, do you guys own the ramp?
We don't have any ramp. We don't have any,
All
the
the-
tie down, all the paid tie downs are on OK3's leaseable.
Okay.
And we don't get a percentage of those.
And how about the rental car? Is there a rental car lease fee?
My understanding is there's not.
Not now. So the reason that we're doing this whole fee study is for those very reasons.
So where those rental cars are always parked, there's no fee being collected by the city?
No. So typically
Okay.
what you'd have is you'd have a permit process for the rental car business to be able to operate at the airport. Same thing with TNCs. So those are transportation network companies, Uber, Lyft. That's what we're talking about there. If they're going to access the airport, usually you'd have them permitted in order to come onto the airport, and then there's the fee for that permit process.
But the reality is we're not talking about large sums of money, even if we were collecting.
No, and a lot of times the administrative cost of having Travis do it is not worth the little bit of money you're going to collect in revenue. So that's part of what we're going to look at as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I like looking at all sorts of opportunities, right? But
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we want to make sure we explore all the opportunities. Just because it's feasible doesn't mean we're going to recommend that the airport institute a new fee just to if it's going to generate a little bit of money, it's probably not worth the cost of going through the process of implementing it.
Okay.
So I mentioned there's really two general approaches to setting rates and fees. There's cost recovery and there's the market-based approach. I'm going to start with cost recovery first. So rates and charges are generally adjusted based on aeronautical activity to cover the rate base. So if you look at this hierarchy that I kind of built here, you've got your allowable costs. Those are your operating expenses and then capital expenses for any major projects that you've got coming up. You subtract the AFP funds that you're getting from the FAA out of that because they're already paying you to cover those costs. Yep.
Time out, just one sec. Could you go back to that last slide?
Sure.
So there's one fund there's one source of income that we have for this airport that's kind of unique to Utah. And I like this about Utah, right? So we all pay a registration fee to the state of Utah, and we pay that in lieu of property taxes on our aircraft, right? The idea behind that, it's something like what, 90% of that money, or maybe it's 50% of that money goes back to the airport.
That's right. Yep.
Okay. And so to me, I think that this kind of is an underrepresentation on what the users of the airport that are based here are actually contributing back to that airport. And I mean, that's for everybody that's got an airplane here, a significant sum of money.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that we reflect that somewhere. I understand that that's used to offset perhaps when you get into the next slide, how much money we have to come up with. But if I was looking at this and I didn't know about that, I'd say, well, hey, people that have an aircraft there are getting off scot-free. They're not paying anything for it.
Yeah, and I know this is a point of Travis's concern too, is who's considered a base aircraft? Because you can have an aircraft, you can have a hangar at Heber, but if you're not registered in the state, then you're not paying that state tax. And that's always a tricky point of how do you count based aircraft?
And it's not like they write us a check or anything. It's not like we have it on there. My understanding is it comes through your AIP, your discretionary funds. It's not like a check that they say, hey, guess what? You had all these airplanes, so here's this much. They
Yeah.
just roll it into, oh, well, we'll give you that as part of this project that we're doing for you.
So the UDOT funds are separate from AIP, right? And so they actually wouldn't even, I don't think would be counted as subtracting from allowable costs. That's really the federal dollars is what the FAA is looking at here, right? So I don't know if you would subtract those UDOT dollars from the allowable cost to get the rate base. I don't think that would be the case because it's really not federal money that's coming in. Where the UDOT funds come in is usually on the match when you're doing a capital project. So you go to when you've got an AAP eligible project, you're looking to fund it. The FAA says we'll put up 90%. UDOT usually comes in and says we'll put in 5%, I think, for the projects. And it's not every project, but you go to them and ask for some money, and that's how that money's coming back to the airport.
It also helps, from what I understand, because if you have more based aircraft and more operations, then you're bumped up on the importance scale. So like if you need snow removal equipment and Fillmore needs snow removal equipment, because we have people paying into this state thing, they recognize us as having more. It's more important that we get taken care of than the guys that have less based aircraft.
How do they determine what airport those aircraft are based at?
You registered.
Well,
Who's
you're
registered?
talking about the registration. So in theory, that ties me to the Heber Airport.
So
Is that how you
they
do it?
used to like literally come out with binoculars and like look at people's tail numbers and say, hey, we're seeing these people here. Now it's more with all the ADSB tracking that they have on everyone. You're not going to be able to make it up anymore. They're going to say, you are here obviously 6 months in a day. You have to pay at least something towards that state.
Okay. And that makes sense. I just wanted to make sure that
Yeah,
I clarified it.
And this is all pretty new for airports because it's been a really hard process to try and figure out who's a base tenant at the airport. And a lot of people would register the aircraft in a tax-friendly state, and they'd spend 365 days elsewhere. And there was no way to really to prove that up. So with the new ADSB technology, you guys are talking about landing fees as well and how you collect landing fees. All of those help to kind of reconcile where people are spending their time, and it makes it a little bit easier to go after those users that are trying to not be considered a based aircraft for tax purposes.
So I just got a bill from Vector Aerospace, right? And when I went to an airport to collect landing fees, it was Sun Valley. And you know, if you're based there, right? If you're based there, you got to let them know, and then they'll waive the fee. But then they know that you're based there, and that information goes to the airport. Maybe we should. I mean,
Yeah.
it's nice because they've got the technology to really be able to enforce that too, which is nice.
Yeah.
And that's one of the points that Travis has brought up in just conversations we've had of incentivizing people in terms of the rates and fees to be based at Heber. It's a little bit challenging when I look at the kind of the policy and rates and charges because the FAA considers that even though you have certain people based at the airport, it's almost discriminating against transient aircraft because they're paying into the airport through the AAP funds, right? Because everybody's paying into the federal trust fund, and those trust funds come back, and that's 90% of the revenue that goes to the capital projects. So I know we've kind of talked about, can you have higher fees for transient aircraft? That's something I think we're going to do a little bit more research on and see how much you can differentiate between based aircraft and transient aircraft. So this top-down approach I was working on here, right? You've got your allowable costs, and really this is taking a look at what the budget is for backward, forward, essentially just looking at the budget for a year on all of these identified allowable costs, coming with that one number of here's what we think we're going to have to cover. Then you subtract AIP funds from that because that's already coming from the federal government, and that's how you get to your rate base. In order to establish rates, fees, and charges, you take that rate base divided by aeronautical activity. Now, it's not that simple, right? Like I said, there's a lot of different metrics that we're going to cover under aeronautical activity. You've got fuel flowage fees, which are gallons of fuel sold at the airport, can even be delivered versus pumped. You look at operations, so landing fees. It's not just all operations, could be a certain category of aircraft, usually based on weight. Some people do it on a price per 1,000 pounds. Others do it in certain categories. So they'll say 12,500 up to 30,000 pounds is one category at one price. So there's a couple different ways you can set those rates and charges, but that's essentially using the cost recovery approach to establishing rates and charges. How much money do we have to cover in the rate base? What's the activity that we have? And let's set charges that are going to add up to that rate base, plus maybe a little bit of surplus we can put in the airport reserve fund. So Travis, I did have one question for you that from the presentation you gave. One of the tricky parts of doing this is you have a really hard winter, right? And then that increases costs that you can't forecast for. I don't know you're the one out there plowing snow, so I don't know how much that really increases the cost. Do your costs go up quite a bit from a hard winter like this last one?
The only real cost is the increase in fuel, and I wouldn't say it's significant.
It's pretty marginal.
We've probably doubled the fuel that we use, but we get it in bulk and
But you're discounting, the amount of hair that Travis was pulling out because of the fact that he was out there,
that was a crazy winter. It looks like we're having another one. That's good though. We need
and whether that's sustainable. He doesn't have a lot of hair left, and so he might need some new snow equipment.
Got
and
one good season left.
Yeah. Then I'm out. No.
Our first project needs to be a heated runway when we do the new runway, heated runway and taxiways.
There you go. I'm sure that'd be
Nice.
very inexpensive.
They've experimented that. It doesn't work very good from what I've heard. So the point I was making, though, is it's not as simple as I kind of lay it out, because a lot of those costs, even looking out 12 months in advance, are not very forecastable. Talking with their snow removal budget last year was like triple what they had budgeted for. And we're talking millions in excess of what they initially thought they were going to need in order to cover. But that's really the cost recovery approach. Most airports will, well, I shouldn't say that. Most airports will do a hybrid, and you can do cost recovery versus market based on different fees. Again, there's no one right way to do this. So when you do, as we look here at ground rent and fuel flowage fees, for example, you could say we want to do a market based approach with ground rent and fuel flowage fees. So when we looked at the rates and charges survey that we did in that feasibility analysis, what we found is that Heber is the lowest by far in a lot of cases from the comparable airports that we looked at. I mentioned the fuel flowage fee already at 5 cents. Really, I don't know if you're going to find many similar airports where they're going to have a fuel flowage fee less than what Heber is charging right now.
Our ground rent rate's significantly higher than that.
Well, so the 7 cents that we've got there is for, I think we put it as like a ramp apron ground rent fee. So there's the hangar rent, and then there's the ground rent fee. So there was another category that we looked at here. When you look at the hangar rent, it was actually slightly above average. That's why I didn't put it on the slide here, but
We should put that on the slide.
yeah, I didn't have room. I tried to.
I think that's important, right?
Absolutely. And even though that was one of the top 3 categories, that's not one that I think you really want to look at adjusting, right? Because it's already pretty close to market in terms
we have
of
contractual obligations on that, and we
Yeah.
can't adjust some of those.
And I'm going to come back to that too, because kind of the ideal state in what you do is the outcome of doing this survey or the study is publishing a schedule of rates and charges. And the idea is that the city council essentially approves a rates and charges, and that all the leases point back to that survey of rates and charges to say this is what it's going to be for these users. That way you don't get these differentiations in leases because somebody negotiated it one year and then the next year a different rate was negotiated, because again, that could be considered economic discrimination. So the best practice is to have a document. I think it might be my next slide. Here we go. This is City McCall. This is a resolution of the city council where you can't see it, but kind of behind there, you've got all the different categories from hangar waiting list fee, landing fees, you've got ag operators, vehicle access fees for the AOA, and it's a set price that's established for all of those, passed by city ordinance, and then the lease just points to whatever the current one is. So as those are regularly adjusted, the lease is automatically updated, rather than having a set price written into there for a ground lease and a different adjuster and different ways of kind of truing up the rent. It's really easy to manage it this way. So that's kind of like what we want to get to is in ideal state.
You mentioned update. Are you okay?
No, you have a question? That's fine.
Well, are you going back to that slide in
Yeah.
a minute? Okay. Well, when you get there, I'll ask the question.
Okay. The last point I wanted to make here when we did look at bringing Heber up to what I'd say market prices, it's not that hard to get to a net positive cash flow position for the next 20 years and cover all of those C2 upgrades, right? When we looked at this, I think what we assumed was fuel flowage fees coming up to, the 15 cents and the ground rent rate actually coming up to the next highest, which was 25 cents. And that's the assumption that we use to get to that, what I call break even. It's actually about $70,000 a year surplus.
Is the ground rate, I know that there was a new lease that was signed. Was that ground rent rate changed in that lease? With the FBO, or maybe that's when they're going to move.
Yeah, so through the settlement agreement, yeah, some of their costs are changing. And
So,
one of those is the apron.
So
But they would be paying market rate though.
I don't know what market rate is, but they have an agreed rate that they're going to. And it's a lot
Yes,
more than-
it was 2 cents a square foot before, and now I think we brought it up to 7 cents a square foot.
Okay, so their new one is bringing it into to the 7 cents that we're seeing right here.
That's right.
Okay.
And then all of the new construction that's proposed will automatically be at the new current market rate that we have on
like
record.
new hangars and new buildings that they build will be equal with
Right.
the market rate.
Once that's done, right? So this was an incremental improvement over where we were. And then if the environmental study, according to the ALP, right, if the environmental study is good and then an FBO moves down to, to the south area, that would be at a, at least it would be at a rate that's closer
to market rate. Yes.
And that's what I meant. It would be our commercial market rate. So if you're a commercial operator, there would be a commercial market rate. If you're an individual, you have a commercial hangar rate and a commercial. So it's standardizing it like you're doing in McCall.
Exactly. Ideally, you have that rate published, and most airports will actually put this on their website. So it makes my job of doing these surveys really easy, because we can find it on the website and look and see everything that they're charging rather than having to pick up the phone or email them.
Can you go back to the comparables that you used there? So, so I don't see a lot of like airports close to us, right? So I don't see Evanston on here, right? I mean, that's an alternative airport that I know a lot of people use instead of Heber. It's, 45 minutes by car, 5 minutes by air. Vernal. I mean, I think it's important that we probably, hey, I'm glad that we're using Sedona and Deer Valley and South Lake Tahoe, but those aren't our airport. Those are completely different metropolitan areas. I mean, we should really be looking at like similarly situated airports. As I sat in the council candidates forum earlier today, a lot of the stuff that was talking about was, hey, we like Heber being, Heber. And so if we start trying to make Heber, but then the airport's Aspen, that's kind of a problem, isn't it?
Yeah. Jason, you've hit on the crux of
Actually, because the traffic coming here is the same traffic going to all of those places. They're not going to Evanston. They're not going to. Well,
I know plenty of challengers
and they're not, because that's their choice. But that's why this is an elite airport. I mean, we are a mountain town. We are a resort feeder airport. We need to be compared to like resort feeder airports. I can see what you're saying about competition nearby, and it's each one person's choice if they decide they want to go base themselves in Evanston. But I'd say we're competing with. It's like saying, the Ritz-Carlton is competing with the Motel 6. Evanston, Vernal, Delta is the Motel 6, and people keep bringing that up. Like, I'll go fill my jet up in Delta. Well, that's your choice, but this is not Delta. You don't live here in Heber Valley or Park City because you don't want to live in Delta. You want to live in Park City, Heber. We are a destination resort. So I disagree with that, but I think we do need to be comparing to destination resorts because that's who we are.
Yeah, you guys hit on the crux of like, this is the biggest challenge with doing rates and fees studies. I've probably done 5 or 6 of these in the last year, And there's been times where we have to get attorneys in the room and negotiate which airports are going to be part of the study. And everybody wants to cherry pick the ones they think are going to work out the best for them. But sometimes the ones that you think are going to be higher or lower aren't that way either. Because again, it's all based on recovering your costs. And so, when we did this, we kind of looked at resort type airports, right? Um, what I've done since then is I've kind of come up with a really geeky methodology for how to pick this in a way that is completely objective. And I basically created a database from the 5010, the airport or the airport facility directory, and I can look at anything that they've got in AFD, and I can go and actually compare Heber to all 19,000 airports in the country and say which one does it come the closest to. Now, typically what I do is let's just look at the region, right? Any state that touches Utah. Let's look at those airports in that region. And probably the best metric is honestly number of C2 operations, not just total operations, but like C2 or larger aircraft. But we also look at the number of acres on the airfield, the length of the runway. Do they have a control tower? Do they have an ILS approach system? All of those types of things. The NIPIAS role, right? So Heber is considered a GA national airport. It's actually a really unique category. There are very few GA national airports, but you've got a lot of the next step up from that would really be a non-hub airport or I wanted to say it like a local airport is what they call the step down from that in kind of the rankings. So looking at the different characteristics of the airport is really how I try and go to objectively pick the different airports to be able to compare in a rates and fee study now.
So I guess I understand what you're saying, Scott. And then my question would be, why do we have like Chino and Thermal and Phoenix Deer Valley in here, right? Because those are decidedly, not, they're Motel 6 at best, maybe on a good day. So I take a look at that and I'm like, okay, I mean, I'm actually shocked at Phoenix Deer Valley's 25 cents on flowage fee based upon what I paid for gas in there not too long ago.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
and
crazy,
like I
right?
said, some are different than what you expect to.
But most of those have ILSs and most of those have control towers, right? We have a very high approach and all of that. Now, I'm not disagreeing. I guess I should say I'm not disagreeing with the analysis that you're doing here. I'm just trying to be able to rationalize it to somebody when I talk to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea with this was really
be another way to look at it. If you were to go sell your hangar, who would you be comparable to as far as price for a hangar? Would you compare to Delta or Evanston or Sun Valley?
I honestly say I've not been to Delta ever. So I fly over it. It's a VOR. No, I mean, I think
wanting to fill up in Delta because it's, $4 a gallon jet fuel or whatever price it is. It's super low.
They don't sell jet fuel there.
Who?
But no, I understand what you're saying, Scott. I'm not disagreeing with that. And I'm not disagreeing with the numbers that are up here either, from where you're coming with it and where we rank, right? Because regardless of if it's a resort, destination or it's Chino, which is, again, decidedly not a resort destination, we're still out of kilter with that.
Yeah. And so, again, this wasn't a full-on rates and fees study. We did a survey of similar airports and used those to be able to come up with an analysis to kind of pick some numbers just as comparable airports. The one up here that's probably the most intriguing is actually Driggs. Driggs, I would say, is really similar, not too far from Heber. It is just outside of Jackson Hole. A lot of similar characteristics when you look at the airports themselves, and falls right in line, kind of an average with fuel flowage fees, and is the next lowest when it comes to ground rent rates. So even the pricing is really kind of comparable to what you'd see.
Did you do any comparison on the resort airports, right? So I'd really literally take like Phoenix out and Chino, but some of these, to Scott's point, are destination airports. To not only compare the flowage fees, but the amount of flowage that was occurring, because we could put our flowage fee wherever we want. If you're not selling a lot of fuel, you see what we saw on the chart there.
Getting that information is a lot harder, right?
Well, isn't it? I mean, it's not, because you know what their flowage fees are and you can see what their budget is for it, can't you?
No, you can't see the revenue that they're generating off of flowage fees. Yeah. And a lot of times you ask an airport manager, how much fuel are you selling at the airport? They don't know. Do you know how much you're selling here? No, because it's pumped by the FBO. And
understood.
And that was going to be a question I was going to ask, not to go off the rails here, but how do we collect the data on how many gallons are sold?
Um, they give us, it's quarterly, monthly, I think now. We just changed it. So I think it's monthly now, but they show us the bill of lading thing that shows how many gallons that they brought. And then they give us a check for 5 cents a gallon.
And is it based on gallons delivered or actually pumped?
I think it's pumped is what they have right now.
And there's multiple ways of doing this. The best practice is actually collecting it from the fuel service provider, who then collects it based on what's delivered, and they collect that from the FBO. So it's kind of a pass through the fuel service provider.
I would think that you'd have certain approved providers and they would send an invoice and say, hey, we delivered 5,000 gallons. And here's the check to you guys for the flowage on delivery rather than maybe pump. So you're not waiting on the on it to be sold, I guess, the best way to put it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Ryan, I look at these fees and I've looked at documents and it looks like these fees that we charge at Heber have been the same for quite some time. I mean, going back at least, 10, 15 years? And I wonder if at one point the fees were similar to other airports. They went through a fee study like this, and maybe they looked at South Lake Tahoe and Driggs and Coeur d'Alene and everything, and they just had, I mean, inflation in and of itself would have doubled our fuel flowage fee over the last couple of years, right? And I wonder if we just, because of the master plan and, other thing, pandemic and all of the other things that just kind of are involved, we just didn't stay on task of making sure that we were consistent with the other airports.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jason. And that happens quite a bit. When you look at the fuel flowage fees in particular, that's not one that you're adjusting all that often, right? So typically that's a market-based one where you'll do a comparison like that and say, we're going to set it at 10 cents and we'll revisit that in 5 years. It's not one that we're going to go adjust based on activity. The reason why I brought this slide up because really kind of think in this ideal state, I talked about having a schedule of rates and charges that are approved by city council, but you also want to have a rate setting methodology. And that's what we're going to do in this report is here's the approach to setting rates and charges. Let's do market-based for fuel flowage fees and ground rent. And then we can balance the budget based on landing fees, right? And so landing fees can move up or down. And we'll go and actually look at the rate based on allowable costs in an annual report so that Travis comes back, not to give you any more work, but that we do an annual report on what the allowable costs are or the rate base is. And we look at that every year. How do we do in terms of generating revenue that cover the cost of the airport? Do we need to make adjustments to any of the fees in order, for the next year to make sure that we've got enough to cover the forecasted?
But I am a little worried that when you adjust, you use to, you make up for it with the landing fees. If it gets really bad, those landing fees could go high. And then once you do that, then you're going to curtail people coming. And so then you're not going to collect any landing fee. You're not going to collect any fuel flowage fee from them. So how do you, I mean, that's a balancing act, right?
It is totally a balancing act, yeah. And it's trying to find that sweet spot. I mean, if you were to do all market-based pricing, there's no guarantee that you're going to generate enough revenue in order to break even, right? So it's nice to have something at least to be able to balance the budget. But if it gets too far out of whack, sometimes you may have to go above market pricing in the other ones because you're relying too much on a different price that you're using to balance the budget.
What happens if let's just hypothetically say we need, would you say $1.4 million in 20 years for over the next 20 years is what we needed to complete the projects as I may have missed it. Just take a number, right?
Yeah.
Hey, we've had economic recession. We've got, people aren't landing here as often as they are. Whatever the case might be, we generate $1.2 million. Does that just push the project out from 20 years to say 22 or 23 years until you have more money to be able to pay for them?
It could. That's all up to how the city wants to proceed with those projects. Yeah.
I mean, we don't turn into pumpkins if that doesn't happen, do we? Okay, sorry, getting close to Halloween. I'm just trying to understand the ramifications of if we undershoot on some of this, right? Because like I said, in my other life, I worry about, price elasticity.
Yeah, a lot of these airports that we looked at aren't even self-sufficient, right? Again, that's the goal, is to be self-sufficient. It's not a requirement by the FAA. So you've got some. I think I was looking at North Tahoe today. They're when they did the rates and fees study, I think it was this year or last year. They on average are having what $500,000 a year come from the city general fund in order to cover that cost. We don't want that, exactly, no. And that's why you do these studies, because it is easy for this to kind of get lost in the shuffle of all the other busy work. And then the rates and fees don't get adjusted and you end up kind of on the bottom of that list. What you want to do is be looking at this on a regular basis, trying to stay ahead of the curve so that you don't get into that position. The last one I have on here, leasing policy, and I think I kind of hit on this when we talk about the main documents. So we talked about minimum standards, which I understand KKR is working on.
So who's KKR?
Kaplan Kirsch.
Steve Vossett, Peter Kirsch. That's Kaplan and Kirsch.
When should we have a draft of that to look at?
Of the updated minimum standards?
Yeah.
I don't know. He's started on it. He's working on it. But I don't know that we have a date. Yeah.
Get it set? I mean, I think that, that's obviously pretty important.
Yeah. It's something we plan on commenting on. So I know that they're working on it. We haven't seen a draft of it yet, but Travis, I'll leave that for you to follow up with Steve on and see.
Steve's working on a few things since we got done. He's got some things he's doing, but.
And like I said, those minimum standards are really important as you're doing rates and fees to make sure that everybody's under the same conditions. And ideally what you have is minimum standards that establish for the commercial aeronautical service provider. You've got your rates and fees that's this kind of schedule of rates and charges. And you've got your rules and regulations that establish the safety operations in an airport. And the leasing policies, when you're writing a lease, it's pointing to all of those different documents, right? So rather than writing in specific permitted services into a lease, you say you need to comply with whatever the minimum standards is for fixed-based operators, limited service FBOs, whatever they are, flight training providers. And that ensures that all of those leases are staying the same and everybody's being treated equally, and that the pricing is staying equal as well because it's pointing to the schedule of rates and charges. I think that's everything I had.
And I assume on the minimum standards, those will come to us. We'll have an opportunity to discuss those, to provide the local input that was referenced on that one slide.
I assume so. Again, we're not working on those, so we'll comment on them, but I'm sure Travis will bring those to you when the time comes.
Well, there have been changes to the minimum standards already agreed upon as part of the settlement agreement, right, Travis?
Have they been agreed upon? They agreed that we were going to revisit them.
Okay, because I'm not sure on this draft, like how much say we'll have as a advisory board, at least pertaining to what was instituted.
Yeah, I mean, there's things in the settlement agreement that will affect some of it, I'm sure. But
and I'm not privy to the settlement agreement, but I would imagine that those relate to the FBO's activities, not to other aeronautical activities.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Right. So
And,
I'm sorry. What was that, Scott?
Well, go ahead. I was going to go back to another topic. Go ahead.
Okay. No, I thought I cut you off. That's all.
I just want to say, Jason, on the fees and things, it's like you said before with hamburgers and tacos. If you raise fees too much, you start losing business. So we have to be aware of that as well.
Right. I mean, I think we all have a vested interest in making sure that we have a vibrant airport community that's able to be self-sufficient and is able to provide for, what's required of the airport over the next 20 plus years, right? It's just, there's always a series of trade-offs. And if I'm judging, again, just looking at the slides that I've got in front of me, right, with nothing else, it looks like we are starting from a position of, being really behind the 8 ball. And so we have to be careful that we don't do something that's going to be, shocking to the system. And we have some graduation maybe to get there.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. A good approach is to phase those in as well, right? You don't have to just jump right up to market or whatever the new prices are. You can do a 5-year plan of gradually stepping those up to get to where you think you need to be in 5 years. And
it goes back to my earlier point of finding, we're assuming that the only aeronautical activities that we're able to generate income from at the FBO are what we currently have there, right? And so I know you said in your plan you were building a 3% escalation. Well, that's, typical, just inflationary expectations. But, maybe we won't have just an FBO that's generating that. Doesn't mean we're going to have competitors to that. I want to be clear of saying that. It means that we could have alternative forms of commercial activity. I'll speak to like part of that after we're done with the general business. I think there are opportunities for us to find other sources of revenue.
Yeah, and I think the big challenge with Heber is just the C2 upgrades are expensive. And even if you're just paying 5%, that's still a lot of money that you got to come up with over the next 20 years. And so that's got to come from somewhere, right? And ideally not the general fund. So you've essentially got to bake that into the fees in order to cover your contribution.
I mean, I think we all heard loud and clear during the master planning process, and it's something that I've said. Scott, I've heard you say it. The airport needs to be self-sufficient.
Are there any, like we talked
Number one
about
thing we
rental
heard
cars?
from public.
What I was saying is, for instance, like the rental car is an example. That's just an untouched market. We haven't. So in theory, if we said, hey, we're going to look at 100 spaces that are leased to Hertz, Avis, and they pay $1,000 a month to park those cars there. Are those things that we want to explore? Because I look at that and say that's a completely untouched market that we have space that's already set aside for it. That might be a good one. I was going to ask, are there airports that charge a percentage of the sale price on fuel versus like a per gallon? I'm just trying to think out of the box. What are other ways that we can help generate revenue but be equal in how it's done?
Yeah, and that's the challenge too, right? Is trying to be equal in how it's done and who bears the biggest burden for the expenses. Particularly when you look at where are the expenses coming from. That gets really kind of messy to try and say, well, these users are the ones that are generating the most expense, and it's not a good way to do that. To answer your question, the fuel cost or the fuel revenue, I should say, fuel flowage fees are usually a cents per gallon. That's the typical way to do it.
Okay.
There is something called a throughput fee though. So if the airport owns the fuel farm and you're leasing that out, then you could do a percentage of sales on the fuel as a collection of to recover the cost of putting in the fuel farm and running that.
But that's almost cost recovery.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not doing that right now, so we'd have to make a capital expenditure to do it, and we'd use that to justify doing that. I mean, that seems like that might not be accretive.
Exactly. Yep. So my point is, there are some places that do that. Not that happened here at Heber because you don't have a fuel farm that's owned by the city, but there are certain airports that do that in unique situations. I think to answer your other question, ideally you want to have as much non-aeronautical revenue coming in as possible.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. Or what, if fuel flowage fees, landing fees are, let's call them really competitive, they're regulated based on other airports. What are those other fees that come in? Again, whether it's, well, hangars are going to be pretty standardized, but what are those other fees that come in from other businesses? And how do we attract those businesses to the airport so that there are other revenue streams that give us more comparables with other, let's call them resort airports?
Yeah, there's some of it already at Heber. I know you have an agricultural lease, right? I mean, we're talking a few $1,000s a year. It's not much, but it's a good compatible use, right? Because ag land is great to have around the airport. You can have that in your safety areas, or at least in the, it's some of the safety areas. But a lot of other airports, ideally, what you want to have is land. If you can get land around the airport, because that's where the non-aeronautical revenue is coming from. And you look at all the activity that's being generated around the airport because it's there, and you don't get a piece of that if you don't own the land. So a lot of airports will have business parks that they're using with the land adjacent to the airport because of the benefits of having it in proximity to the airport. The challenge with that then is you're almost competing with private industry and business developers. So it's a slippery slope to go down. You look at Salt Lake, for example, on the west side of the airport, they have a whole bunch of property that the city has bought up that the airport owns. And it's a whole bunch of office buildings. They've got, and even to the south of the airport on the approach, they own all of those, all that industrial zoned area as well. And they're leasing that out. It's great non-operating or non-aeronautical revenue, but again, you're competing with private industry at that point.
But we don't have.
I don't
that
think.
ability. I mean,
I don't think that's
we're
ever going to happen in
Yeah, I mean, we're small. I mean, we have a small parcel of land for the airport. I think that was part of the problem when you were working on the ALP was there just wasn't a lot of places to put things, right?
And the city doesn't want to see the airport footprint grow either. That's, I think, the biggest hurdle. Ideally, the best way to mitigate noise around the airport is own the property. That's what the FAA will tell you. And so if you can own the property around the airport, especially now while it's farmland, that gives you the opportunity to develop that later on in, non-aeronautical revenue. But that's not something the city really wants to pursue either. So those are ideal cases if you've got, airports that are out in the middle of nowhere and think ahead and are buying this property. But
So what about things like, well, first of all, how many operations did we have at the airport? Do you remember off the top of your head?
13,000, a little over 13,000.
Do we have any idea how many of those were like for the class,
C2?
C2
It's in the
aircraft?
forecast chapter, but
I want to say I'm gonna say 1,300.
Okay, so not a tremendous amount when you think about those being the challengers and larger aircraft that are coming in, right? Which would, in most cases, just when I look at the ramp, right? This is purely just a completely non-scientific study. I look at the ramp; those are the people that be renting the cars, those people that are paying the higher landing fees just because of the weight of the aircraft, and things like that. There's not a lot of levers that we have that we can pull here. And even when I think about like a $20 security fee that I had, if that's assessed by the airport, I mean, that doesnn't add up
It
very
doesn't
fast.
really cover Travis's time in doing a lot of that stuff
Yeah,
either,
no,
right?
I mean, it doesn't, right? I mean, to your point earlier about the ministerial act of doing it. Um, so what I'm hearing you say, as much as, you know, it'd be nice to be able to spitball and find all sorts of other sources, we really have, you know, fuel flowage, sell more fuel, higher fuel flowage fees, landing fees. And we really don't want to have pardon me?
And rents, ground rent.
Ground lease.
Yeah,
But our ground lease rates, aside from what we have on the commercial side right now, which we have a contract with that for, so there's nothing that we can do about a lease that's in place today. We can look to the future. Our private hangars that we have and the non-ground, so I guess the hangar lease rates are at market rate. It's just the raw land, the aprons that are below the market rate.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
Okay, so and so that's, part of a commercial operation is the apron, but the hangars, I believe, are probably close to
And
market
you,
rate.
like you saw, the hangar rents are already pretty hot. Well, when I say the percentage of revenue that they're bringing in at the airport are already over 40%, which is what you kind of expect in an airport like this.
So, I mean, I'm just trying to go through my mind of like, all right, what can you do I mean, we can charge another gate fee for somebody that wants to have access, but I mean, that it's not going to get us to $1.4 million.
Those three that you mentioned are always going to be 90% of your revenue.
Okay. And so is it unusual to see the flip-flop? I mean, you said you've done 4 or 5 studies this year. Is it unusual to see the landing fees be larger than the fuel flowage
It's
fees?
unusual to see an airport, a GA airport, have landing fees.
Okay.
There are some, and the resort ones are probably more common. But yes, small GA airports typically don't have landing fees, and so they're more dependent on the fuel flowage fee then.
Just curious, right? I mean, this is.
And sorry, one more question. When you talked about the ground lease as a percentage, were you talking about total revenue of ground lease as opposed as compared to overall revenue, or were you talking about the price per square foot?
No, the first one that you mentioned. So of the total revenue that the airport generates, ground leases or hangar leases are bringing in about 40. I want to say it was about 43% of the total revenue.
Okay. And so, but that could be based on, let's call it quantity of land, because that's a number that could be very elastic depending on how big the site is.
And there's not a lot of developable land that you have left, right, Travis, to do additional hangars? I know you're looking on the ALP to try and find ways to squeeze some in, and there's just not much there.
That's what cracked me up about everybody calling it airport expansion, when our developable space was about 40 acres. And then by the time you take out the apron and hangar row and all these hangars and the maintenance hangar, and then you replace those, I mean,
Smaller.
we have very little room left for.
And it's one where there's a lot of demand, right? There's a lot of people that want hangars, and if you had the space to develop them, there's a whole bunch more revenue you could bring into the airport. But you don't have the land in order to be able to do that.
Well, I don't think the residents don't want that. And so
And that's a guiding principle, right? I think, the small community airport is still important. At least that's important to me, operating there, right? You like that feel. It's in a resort, right? So we've got that, and that's a piece that we have to kind of keep in mind, right? Which is, much like some of these other airports that you put up there, they don't have huge, developable areas as well, right? So that's perhaps why you see some of the fees at those where you see them.
Well, I think we need to think developing differently. Like when we replace hangar row, are we replacing like hangars? Or are we going to do T hangars? Can we, looking at how we build that out is going to be important, because I think we could probably double the amount of aircraft we can have on the field if we build more smart size hangars.
No, that's absolutely true, Scott. The problem is when you're doing the hangars, unless the city is actually going to own the hangars, you're still just leasing the land. So it's, a square foot's a square foot, right? It'd be nice, you could fit more aircraft in there, but you've got to hope that those aircraft are taking fuel and flowage fees that are going to the airport to, provide other sorts of revenue, right? That's
Right. Totally true.
Yeah, that's one thing we've seen in doing a lot of these studies is I think it's good to push having a diversity of space and users at the airport, right? I think that's one thing that makes Heber great too, and you've hit on that a lot, Travis. Looking at some of the Southern California airports we've done, the rates that they're charging for ground rent, the only way to make money off of it is to build really big hangars for really big aircraft. And so a lot of these airports, light GA is getting pushed out of airports because the developers, it's just like with houses. You don't see a lot of single family homes because it's a lot better to do high density housing because your returns are better. And airports are raising their rents to a point where even if a developer wanted to come in and build light GAT hangars, they're not going to be able to cover the cost of doing that. They're going to have to build large box hangars in order to cover that cost. So the pricing strategy is part of that, along with what you're planning in terms of what you're approving for plans in terms of the development.
Well, it comes down to, again, I think you touched on it, and I've heard Scott speak to it. I can't remember if he did today, but the diversity of GA that we have at our airport, right? And, it doesn't do us any good to have, large, huge box hangars if we're not generating something from it. I mean, I personally, I wish I was contributing more to the flowage fees here. It's not economically feasible for me to do that. But I mean, I think we have, we have to look at how we can broaden that base and make sure that it's fair and equitable to everybody.
Yeah.
Well, one other thing I would ask is when you did the study and you talk about, let's say, the vacant ground behind Hangar Row, is your study factoring any leasable income from that space?
Yeah, I believe whatever was on the ALP, if there's additional development forecasted, we forecasted the revenue generated from that off into the future. I know we did it with the FBO. I believe that there's plans on the ALP to do additional GA hangars as well, and we forecast the revenue for that also.
So,
Phase that in.
but that's factored into that over that
It
20-year
is.
window?
Yeah, it is. No, again, all of these are based on assumptions that we're just shooting in the dark on, right?
Okay.
Like, what is the ground rent going to be at that point? When does it even happen? We don't know all of this stuff, so we had to make a lot of assumptions on that. But
The way I'm looking at it is, as a board, our job is to help shape the direction of where it goes. And so I'm trying to find out what are those uncovered things, whether it's undeveloped ground or whether it's rental cars that we can have leasable space that brings it in. My hope would be we could turn those rocks over and find revenue that could come into the city through the airport.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Are there any other questions for Ryan?
I just wanted to clarify that we did not talk about high density housing or any of that before this meeting. It's just fun to hear you talk about these different issues that everybody's dealing with all over the country, not just Heber City.
Yeah, I drove in from Sandy and I haven't been to Heber in a while apparently because I did not notice how many huge houses going in on the north side of town.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ryan. Certainly appreciate this. I guess you're kicking off a fee study now. So when could we expect to be able to engage in further discussion of
Yeah,
this?
I should have put the scope on a slide on the scope. I think probably around the beginning of the year is what we're planning on coming back.
Because I wish that Nadeem or somebody from OK3 was here today, because I'd really like to hear their views on, on this price elasticity argument, right? Because there's, as we've just talked about, turning over rocks, there's only so many, wells that you can draw from here. So it'd be nice to get some views from somebody that's dealing with, customers that are coming into Heber on a daily basis as well.
Yeah. How often does the AAB meet, Travis? Is it quarterly?
Quarterly.
Quarterly or as needed.
Quarterly, once a year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll be back at your next meeting,
Yeah.
Okay.
whenever
Fair
that
enough.
is.
Great.
And my understanding is that they are definitely going to be talking to OK3 through this process and getting their opinions
I just
as
think
well.
it's also important to have, these are open forums, right, where we can talk about this and it can be addressed in a public setting, which I think is really beneficial for everybody that's involved, whether they're in attendance tonight or they want to watch it later on, just to be able to understand the decision-making process and that there's always a series of trade-offs here.
And that's where I see the value of having someone from his, or if it is Nadeem, having him here at these meetings, because if he's a huge portion of that revenue stream, any decision made really affects his business. And so I think we want to be careful that we don't affect that in a negative way. And that's where his input would be very
Yeah,
valuable.
absolutely. There's a joint interest in both for the airport and the service providers at the airport.
Yeah, I agree.
Back to the taco argument. If your price of taco is too high, you don't sell any.
I just very much appreciate the different viewpoints because we all come at this from different backgrounds, different experience, and we'll come to a good conclusion in the end. But it's good to have the discussion debate.
Great. All right, let's move on to the next item on the agenda, which is item 3, discussing updates and next steps to the airport master plan. Travis, you kind of talked about that a little bit earlier. Is there anything else to add to that?
Yeah, so Jeremy couldn't make it and Matt's at home, but I talked to Jeremy a little bit about it. These are kind of some notes that I threw up that he was saying next steps in the master plan process are just kind of what's going on at the airport. The master plan and the ALP have been approved and accepted on condition of the environmental assessment, like we talked about earlier. We're closing out the master plan project with the FAA, so that whole deal with them and the engineers is getting wrapped up. We're continuing to work on that phase 2 environmental project over the landfill that we talked about. We put out an RFQ for, there's 2 parts of engineering. So every 5 years or so, airports have to put out an RFQ to say, we're looking for an engineer. You can rehire him if you want, but you have to put it out. So we put an RFQ out. There's 2 parts of it. There's engineering and there's planning. Typically they're both engineers, but sometimes they're not. For the engineering section, we did end up hiring Ardura, who helped us through this whole process. So we brought them back on. So we have a 5-year agreement with them. Anticipated projects that the engineering side of that would, with that contract, include runway and taxiway pavement maintenance, AWAS replacement, snow removal equipment acquisition, perimeter fence replacement, airport access road development, kind of behind Daniel Hanger over there, and then other miscellaneous stuff. So those are kind of the things that will likely at least start on in the next 5 years. So that's kind of what they'll be doing. We will soon be putting out another RFQ for the planning side of our engineering. This could also be Ardura, or it could be another company, and they will be covering things like the main environment assessment for the whole project, specific environmental site assessments, land acquisition, easements, acquisitions, stuff like that, aeronautical use, stuff like that, and then other miscellaneous stuff. Then we'll be scoping an environmental assessment for the entire master plan. That'll take a year to a year and a half, probably. Once the environmental is concluded, we're hoping to receive what they call a FONSI. It's a finding of no significant impact. After that, then we move on to the easements, land acquisition, navigation easements, and that sort of thing. Then we start with phasing and engineering for specific things depicted on the ALP, providing areas for those who are going to be displaced, places for them to go. And then we go to hangars and taxiway, runway, moving all those. That's down the road. The city is looking at hiring a company to collect landing fees, like you talked about,
Okay, Vector.
Hector. They're kind of the only ones that I know of, but the city council is looking to start doing that. And we're also, like I mentioned, trying to replace the AWAS as quickly as we can. There's some frustrating steps that we have to go through for it, but our engineers are preparing a scope and fees that has to be reviewed by the FAA. Then we put together specs and designs for the city and the FAA and UDOT Aeronautics to review. It's like a document design review. And then we follow a thing called small procurement procedures, which are where we're required to get like 3 bids from there's only like 3 vendors that I know of that make AWASs. So we have to choose one of those and negotiate with them. So we're hoping to get through those steps in February or March.
Great. Any questions?
Travis, I got a question, and maybe I missed something. Right now, the landing fees are collected by OK3, is that correct?
Correct.
Why are we going out, why are we looking at doing it in a different way? And that's a question, not a comment.
Part of the reason they said is that there's planes that come on off hours when they're not around. It's kind of a modern way of making sure you're catching everyone. And that's just what they've talked about having happen.
But I
Typically,
think a
the
lot
airports.
of
Go ahead,
Travis,
Scott.
It's not a concern with OK3. It's merely a way of capturing landing fees that OK3 is not able to capture.
right, and on their they get it on their statement from OK3 currently. It's not a city statement, and I feel like a lot of the some of the complaints that they've had have been based on that fee on their statement that they're being overcharged to land here, and
That's fine. I just,
it'd be great if that could be on it.
And then they're also not being blamed for it, correct?
Yeah, that's my point.
Yeah. I mean, I know I've get bills from Vector and I forgot to pay one once. Man, they dog you. There's no escaping Vector.
But it seems to me it would be great to just have a third-party vendor who does it. Then there isn't any pressure on OK3. There's no pressure on the city. If you landed, it's documented, it's easy, and it should take pressure off of OK3, in my opinion. I think it would help everybody.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm assuming OK3 is okay with that.
It's part of their settlement agreement, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
That's all I got.
Okay. I'd like to make a couple of quick comments. One, I'd like to let everybody know I have a business that recently was approved by the city council to have a temporary commercial permit at the airport for Elemental Aviation. It's a distributor for Pipistrel aircraft, which is a Textron company. We have sustainable aircraft, electric gliders, electric trainers, as well as aircraft that utilize just regular auto fuel instead of low lead. So that's going to be kind of fun. I'm looking forward to that. And it's a revenue base. I know that there's, there'll be a decent amount of revenue that's shared with the city on that, probably thousands of dollars. So I was very appreciative of the city council for allowing me to do that while we get the minimum standards updated. So let's get the minimum standards updated, or at least get the process going.
Quick on
Second,
that, I think it's important to realize that was a 5-0 vote by the city council too.
yeah, and I really am appreciative of the city council. I think it's something neat for the community. I think it's something neat for the community, and this is me in my personal capacity saying that, because it'll, be the first aircraft in Utah that's electric. We'll have it out here. We'll be able to use it as a demonstration. It's kind of cool when you taxi up to the hold short line and the propeller just stops. So anyway, the second thing that I don't know what the process is for this, but there are some new approaches that are visual RNAV approaches that are going to be coming into Heber. They're private approaches, and I've seen them pop up on some GPSs recently. and they come in right traffic. And so that conflicts directly with the left traffic pattern that we have at the airport, and creates, and I've also noticed quite a few larger jets coming in. I saw an ExoJet Citation 10 come in the other day that came in on right traffic. And I just was at a safety briefing last week where the FAA is starting to bust people for engaging in right traffic at left traffic airports. It's a violation of one of the FARs. Ryan, maybe you know that or not. Regardless, as I'm looking at that, and every time I take off in left traffic, I do question why we're turning left traffic into, a large hill that's right there, whereas right traffic keeps you away from terrain. And I think it would be something to consider of whether this airport should be a right traffic airport. Because you have, on takeoff, you're turning right crosswind if you're taking off on runway 22, so you're not turning into the mountain there. You've got less homes that are being overflown. I don't know what the process is for that. I don't know if that's germane to the airport advisory board, but it seems like somebody should be taking a look at that and trying to determine if that might make sense, especially if you've got a lot of, which you will have a lot of aircraft that are high-speed jet aircraft that are now directly converging with left traffic airport and a base to final, when we have aircraft that are no radio and may not have transponders or ADSB, or gliders for that matter, right? All of our gliders come in that way. Ryan, do you have any knowledge of how that's done? Since you teach this stuff, right?
That's not what I normally teach. I think that first I would just be reaching out to ADO, and I believe it's actually the FSDO that does the traffic patterns, but the ADO would probably be the best place to start and ask. I know down in Provo, they're doing some airspace studies down there as well, because they're talking about putting a shelf over Spanish Fork. And well, it's interesting how that happens, right? The FAA doesn't always talk inside of the FAA. So I'm not exactly sure where to start. The one thing I would say is I know in Phoenix, when they started changing to RNAV approaches, one of the big problems was you had traffic flying over areas of the city where you didn't have traffic before, and that created a lot of problems to a point where they really started even changing. So even though it might be ideal, it might create secondary problems that aren't worth it to go down that road. But
yeah, I don't know. I just know that an RNAV approach that comes in with right traffic, that's not an instrument approach procedure, right? So to your point, probably flight standards didn't talk to somebody that said, hey, it's a left traffic airport. I can just see, I don't want to see that conflict as you turn base to final.
I'll call the ADU and see what they have to say.
Is there anything else from any of the other members of the Airport Advisory Board?
I have nothing.
I have nothing.
Anybody online? All right, well, then
Just
we
thanks
are
for a
adjourned.
great meeting, and it's great to be with all of you guys. Actually, one more thing for Travis. When can people start submitting development requests again to the airport? Are we still under the blackout period, or has that been lifted now?
Apply for what?
Anyone who's
Commercial
looking to develop on the airport, can we do that now, or are we still under the blackout?
I don't think developing we can, but commercial, I believe we can. The reason I say that is part of the agreement with the FBO is we have to make sure that they can actually move down past the museum. So we have to get that environmental done. If it does not work for them down there, then the agreement is that they can use the space behind Hangar Row, and then the light GA limited use FBO would go over by the museum because of
But we're
weight.
still on hold till the environmental studies.
As far as development goes, I believe so. Steve's giving that staff report, I believe, at our next city council meeting. But that's my understanding, is that unless it was depicted like the T hangars, the OK3's hangar, the glider guys, like things like that have already that were already on the old ALP. Those are okay, but I don't think we can like develop behind Hanger Row until we know what's going on with the environmental.
So if it was on the old ALP, perhaps, but if it's on the new ALP, it's still, the moratorium still
Yeah,
is.
as far as
existing.
buildings go, but like commercial activities, if you already have a building and it works or whatever, you can apply for SASOs, that sort of thing. That's my understanding anyway.
Well, that's great.
Does that answer your question, Scott?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, the delay.
No problem.
All right, hearing nothing else, we are adjourned.
Here, here.
Thank you
I
very
move
much.
we adjourn.
Oh, we have to have a movement. That's right. Sorry. I'm thinking something. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Now we are adjourned. Scott made the motion. Thank you, Scott.
Who was that? Who's Sarah Jane? You guys know
Great
Sarah?
job, Ryan.
So Sarah Jane? There was somebody on that was named Sarah Jane. I don't know who that is.
We peppered you pretty hard.
I love it.
You did great.
It's much better than teaching the class.
This is, we're not recording anymore, right? Is it?
It is recording still.